Okay, so now we have an act that I call the Merry Pranksters of Science. We have one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, the legendary Marvin Minsky. We have one of the founding fathers of virtual reality, the legendary Jaron Lanier. We have one of the founding fathers of cyberspace and the internet, the legendary John Perry Barlow, and we have Lee Smolin, the founding father of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, the legendary Mr. Smolin, and they're heavy-duty guys, right? So Barlow comes over to me last night and he says, we're hijacking this thing. Oh, they're heavy-duty guys. So I said, well, what do you have in mind? He says, your format, who cares? We're throwing it out. We want 4 chairs across. Thank you for that vote. And, you know, we just want to talk. So I think about it for a minute. I look at these 4 heavyweight guys, and I say, okay. Well, guess what? You know, when you're dealing with rambunctious kids, right? You say yes? What do they decide? No. No, they don't want to do it that way anymore. So we're going to... Why? Why? Because the way to be rebellious now is to do it my way, right? All right. Marvin, come on up. Boom. All I want to say and can say about Marvin is he's a scientist with a twinkle in his eye.
Huh. I wonder if this will wake up. Nico's said something that reminded me of something I heard W.H. Auden say when I was a student. He came and gave a talk at our school, and in the middle of it he said, "We are all on earth here to help others. What I can't figure out is what the others are here for." You probably can't read that, but I felt I had to put the whole thing on the slide. May be harmful if inhaled, may cause irritation. Inhalation may cause, sort of repetitive, isn't it? Irritation, coughing, and acute pneumoconiosis from overwhelming exposure to silica dust. And it goes on saying that you get cyanosis and chest pain and probably die. So that's a warning on a bottle of sand. Fisher Scientific, washed sea sand. So it's very dangerous. But what I really wanted to talk about is all the problems in the world and how to solve them. And for a few moments, I'm going to repeat some. I try to make up a new talk every time, but I said some of this at a previous TED about a month ago, and I mentioned that there were terrible epidemics around, as some of you might have heard, and that one of the things we should do is stop this ridiculous habit of handshaking. And guess what happened after the talk? 30 people rush up and say, that was a wonderful... So I've discussed that with friends, and the best thing I've found is a suggestion that when somebody offers his hand, you do this. And this is a mysterious gesture, and they don't know what it means. And It's not a full oriental bow. And of course, in Italy, you have to kiss them, and in Argentina, you have to kiss them twice, and so forth. So we get off easy. Anyway, there are a lot of problems that people talk about or don't talk about. And one of them is that there's an energy shortage, and somehow making hydrogen is supposed to help that. It's a wonderful scan. I don't know if it's going on here, but the alleged president of the US gave a little talk about it. Well, each of these has answers, but really, they're all rather common in one respect. If there were only many people propose solutions, and they're not very well thought out. I guess I skipped a slide, or maybe it'll come. But almost all of those problems come from there being a huge population in the world, and supposed to be somewhat over 6 billion. And this is the thing nobody talks about. If we reduced it to some moderate, huge number like 500 million, almost all of those programs would go away. The fossil fuels would last for a great deal of time. Actually, there's some number of people below which the fossil fuels would continue to make new fossil fuels. And, but the ignorance of science in general, and actually the scientists don't understand weather and atmospheric stuff very well yet, certainly vastly better than they did 20 years ago. But generally, there's something called the green movement. I'm not sure what that is, but it's a bunch of people who think that having more trees will help. It won't. Forests are in equilibrium. In the daytime, when the sun is shining on trees, they consume carbon dioxide. In the night, they breathe and give some off. Eventually, they fall over and give all their carbon back. In the meantime, they make lots of other polluting substances. If you've ever lived in a forest, it's not like the poems say. So the thing we won't talk about, even I won't talk about it, is how do we reduce population? Because making it stable won't help very much. And a lot of... Everyone has passed the eye chart test as far as I can tell. So one solution is to make people much smaller, and then you can keep growing. It's like Moore's law. If you make people half the size every generation, then you can double the population every generation. And as any mathematician knows, that can go on forever. But when they get very small like this, we don't know if you can put their brains in that smaller size. The neurons of most animals, are, even small ones, are pretty similar. But then, as you know from the movie Matrix, that's not a problem because, as far as I know, the amount of knowledge in each person is about only the amount that will fit on a CD-ROM or one of these. Everybody's carrying a backup of everything they've ever written, I'm sure, by now. Because it only costs about $50. And so you can have backup copies of yourself in machines, and then the actual people, if they want to go out in the world, can be pretty small. It's very bad to be that small if you ever saw Honey, I Shrunk the Kids or whatever it is. Because the cat will get you, and that's why you want backup copies. But the thing I really want to talk about is why can't we solve the kinds of problems we're facing? And lots of people work on them, but they don't get anywhere. One problem I couldn't... Can you see this little grid? I can't get rid of it. Anybody know? Seriously, what's the command in Microsoft Word to get rid of that? It's in some of my documents and not. It's under view. I believe I've tried everything in view. Which of those? Well, never mind. Someday I'll find out. So, to solve some of these boring problems of pollution and epidemics and so forth, we want to at least stabilize the population someday. Every now and then you run into somebody who says, oh, that's silly. Malthus said that. Was it 300 years ago? When was Malthus? Why don't you all go back to school? Anyway, he was somebody in the past. And he said the day will come when there's not enough room for everybody, and there will be disease and poverty and so forth. And every now and then you run into somebody, look, it's 300 years and he isn't even wrong. I mean, he isn't right. You know, they haven't been to Africa, I suppose.
1766 to 1834.
It sounds like your internet wireless is working. That's good. Anyway, if you stabilize population, then there's a disaster because there's only one child per person, which isn't so bad. And I had a solution to that on the previous slide, namely, everyone has 46, most people have 46 chromosomes. And so with a simple operation, you could get each person to decide which of their chromosomes they liked best, and 46 people would get together and make children. And that way, if 46 people all made, say, 30 children, you'd have a declining population, and yet every child would have this huge number of parents, and their social coherency would increase until it was unbearable, actually. But there is this problem that there's only one worker per retired person or whatever. And Laurie Garrett had a slide that I left out showing what, some of the results of that sort of thing. But it's even worse if we, heaven forbid, increase our lifespan. And in the rest of the talk, I'm going to argue that we have to increase our lifespan so that we can learn more and get smarter so we can solve these problems, or else we have to make machines that can do it. And I can't think of a third choice. But this is a funny problem, and you already see people worrying about it. In the United States, there are people who are saying by the year 2030, there will be only one worker per person, plus 3 Mexicans, I should add. And that poor worker will have to do all the hard work and also have to pay for the pensions of the other people. And they talk about stabilizing Social Security, which is putting money somewhere so that it will be available 30 years from then. Does that make any sense? What good does it do? I mean, never mind. There's something wrong with that, because you could just raise the money then just as well by taking it from the people who have it then. If nobody has it then it doesn't help. So there are these two solutions to our problems. One is to make ourselves live longer and healthier lives. And one of the speakers at that TED that I mentioned a little while ago gave an impassioned talk about how you shouldn't make people live longer, but you should make them into one-horse shays so that they live healthier until they're allotted 80 years. Was that Lincoln, or is that something else? Or the Bible. 77? Never mind. But somebody's going to have to do the work, and I think it would be nice, at least for scientists, to live hundreds of years, because some of the problems that we're working on are very hard, and it takes about 50 years to learn enough about it to get started, and then you're snuffed out. So that doesn't seem very sensible. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about what I think we have to do to get either people or things to be able to figure out harder problems. And since about 1950, there have been people thinking about intelligence and how you could get it into machines, and maybe what is intelligence and so forth. And it's interesting that we don't know much about how thinking works. It's a peculiar thing, you know. In about 3 centuries ago, or about 23 centuries ago, there was this guy Archimedes who figured out a lot of mechanics and almost invented calculus, made some very advanced stuff in geometry. He was sort of the Leonardo of history. That is, Archimedes, a similar inventor to Leonardo, except his stuff worked. And so calculus was almost invented, and then it wasn't invented for 2,000 years, and it's an interesting question why, but one hears about little bits of mathematics. People keep telling me that in Islam, there was a lot of mathematics when it wasn't developed in the other world, but I don't, it seems to me that they got up to high school algebra maybe, but it wasn't until Newton and Leibniz and a few people like that we got calculus. That's a long time ago. And now, in the last 100 years, physics has developed extremely rapidly, and we do understand an enormous amount about the world. And maybe Smolin will tell us what's the next thing. Psychology didn't work that way. And I'm just finishing a book, and you can find it on my webpage, most of it, which has a number of quotations from Aristotle and people like that about common sense psychology. And the annoying thing is that what Aristotle said about affection and rhetoric and that sort of thing still seems rather hyper-modern. And for some reason, the science of psychology didn't develop for thousands of years. It's very strange. In the 1930s, the Swiss psychologist Piaget started to watch his children very carefully and take notes and ask them questions. And he discovered that 5-year-olds don't think the same way that 7-year-olds do, or 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and so forth. You can't find this mentioned anywhere in previous literature that I know of. If you can find some such reference, please email me. But in the past, all the great thinkers, from Aristotle to Hume and Kant and so forth, seem to regard children as ignorant adults. They're the same, they just don't know much, and they develop, and it's known that they develop neurologically a little bit. So the funny thing is that in all these thousands of years of recorded history, there's nothing resembling psychology that I can find until about 1870. Then you had Francis Galton and William James a little later, Wundt. A handful of people started to say, maybe people work this way or that way. I better find out by doing an experiment. And Freud in about 1900. Then we got the first theories of psychology, and as far as I can tell, those people were very brave and smart, but they didn't have any ideas about how to describe the kind of complex processes that thinking involves. So I think the great turning point will be seen in history 1,000 years from now, if there's anyone left, that the invention of computer science made the difference, because for the first time we got elaborate ways to describe very complicated processes. For example, if you wanted to describe how Microsoft Word works, you couldn't find out because they don't publish the source code, and the judge in the Microsoft suit somehow forgot that having them reveal how the thing works might be a remedy for the secrecy and domination of software this is a Macintosh, by the way, but I still use Microsoft Word because it's pretty good. However, if you ask it for help in a question with 2 words, it only pays attention to one of them. But anyway, computer science made this great breakthrough and computers aren't important. The important thing about computer science is that it gave us 1,000 new words about how complicated processes might work. Most neurologists today don't know the difference between an interpreter and a compiler, but there are 2 ways, actually there's hundreds of ways, but I can't think of all the others, for a description of a process to turn into a process. One is to have an interpreter which looks at the description and does what it says, and that kind of program is very powerful, although rather slow. The other is called a compiler, which is what Unix does. The interpreter languages are ones like Lisp and Scheme, which aren't taught very often because computer science departments don't, never mind, because they won't get a job. It's a sort of one of those things. Anyway, people started to try to make machines be intelligent around the 1950s, and tremendous progress was made for about 25 years. Every year, some new breakthrough appeared, and a computer could do something it couldn't do before. Somebody figured out a new kind of process that could recognize new kinds of patterns or do certain new kinds of reasoning that hadn't gotten very far. What didn't happen was getting computers to do the sorts of reasoning and the sorts of recognitions that people can do. And nobody really knows why, but I think it was that for all the virtues of computer science, it neglected the kinds of reasoning that people do. I don't think people ever use logic except after they've solved a problem, and then you use logic to neaten it up and justify it and see whether there's some questions remaining. Most of our reasoning and solving problems is done by looking at this new problem, and you say, that reminds me of this old one that I solved. We do most of our thinking by analogy, and only a handful of people in the world have really worked on computer processes that can, what does that red thing mean? So I'll just go very fast and tell you, you see, there's no point in my giving the lecture. If you look on my web page, and the way to get my web page is to ask Google for Minsky, and then it'll pop up and there'll be my home page, and you click that, that'll pop up, and you'll see something that says The Emotion Machine, and you click that. So I'll just take 30 seconds to show you the sorts of things that you'll find there. Reasons why computers can't think. An explanation of why consciousness is so mysterious. And the reason consciousness is so mysterious is that we use the same word for 30-odd different kinds of processes that our minds do that we don't understand. And when you look at that, you'll see that every one of them is something that you could understand if you worked hard. But as long as you use the wastebasket of the consciousness word and say there's some basic simple thing, then you miss the whole point. The brain has 400 different organs. There is no such thing as consciousness. It's a social word that you use when you say to somebody, you know what I mean. And of course you don't. Am I finished, Moses? So these are some diagrams you'll find there, and it'll discuss all sorts of things. And at the end, it will say that here's an idea of how we could make computers be smart by recognizing different kinds of problems and knowing or ways to find out similar ones that they've solved. And I expect in the next 20 years or so, people will start moving in that direction. AI was a wonderful thing from about 1960 to 1980. Then it deteriorated, and all over the world, people started making stupid robots. and the press ate them up, and young people said, this must be the live thing. Well, those stupid robots were made in the late 1940s by a neurologist named Gray Walter, and as far as I can tell, the stupid robots today are only slightly better than those almost 60 years ago ones made by Walter. So don't let your kids or your students get involved in robotics projects, whatever you do, and get them to read my book and see what they should do.